All right. Well, thanks everyone who has been able to come. It's a smaller crowd than usual because of the time of year, no doubt. My presentation is called Discursive Mindscapes in Regenerative Agriculture, and I'm going to go through some of the different interpretations of regen ag and what that diversity might mean for agricultural transformation. Following on from Chris, before I'd start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the different places from which we're calling in. I'm currently down in Melbourne on Wurundjeri country. I'd also particularly like to acknowledge the place where I'm from and where we farm, which is Marlugi Malal or Moffat Falls, and that's a photo of Moffat Falls on the screen. This place straddles the lands of the Dunghutti, Arawan and Gumbaynggirr people. It's a very important context, I guess, for this research because I've been practicing regenerative agriculture throughout the majority of the PhD. So I'd just like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging there. So during the 2019-20 bushfires, about 300,000 hectares of land was burnt around us or where we farm, and we know that these kinds of disasters will only increase in frequency and severity as climate change progresses. Agriculture contributes significantly to the degradation of the carbon cycle, alongside other systems such as nitrogen and phosphorus flows, deforestation, desertification, and so on. It currently operates on an industrial scale, relying on fossil fuel inputs, multinational companies, and artificial fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides to grow output, which is having a consequence on the health of landscapes. So for me, my research here at ISF is a natural expansion, or I see it as a natural expansion of our farming practices and our responsibilities to place. And so I think it's important to start with this context just to position myself a little bit in the research that I've been doing. And it's disasters like the fires that really drive home for me the need for agricultural transformation and the role of agriculture in many disasters. And so in this research, transformation is understood as a deep and sustained non-linear systemic change, as it says on this slide there. And this involves in all aspects of society: cultural, political, technological, economic, and environmental. So it's not just limited change in farming landscapes, but also involves change in shared social structures, such as discourses, which is what my research has been focusing on. People who share a discourse are actually using language in a similar way and are sharing a sort of a network of meanings and phrases and storylines that form a restrictive or an expressive code of conduct. And these create particular lenses that dictate what is an appropriate way for us to act. The discourses tell a story about the way the world is and our relationship to it that influences our behavior and the way we farm. Because of this, they can open us up or close us down to opportunities for transformation. Modern agriculture is supported by a powerful discourse that invalidates the transformative potential of other alternative models. It does this by downplaying their comparative performance regarding yield, scaling potential, economic viability, and their ability to address the climate crisis. One such alternative is regenerative agriculture, which despite this has nevertheless seen a radical increase recently in popularity amongst farmers, celebrities, and corporations. Regenerative agriculture integrates different farming approaches to restore and realize the potential of damaged landscapes. It remains unclear, however, whether regenerative approaches can shift the discursive power of modern agriculture to transform the way we farm. So with this knowledge gap in mind, the overarching goal of my research has been to understand the discursive characteristics of regenerative agriculture and the implications for agricultural transformation. As mentioned already, my research has been underpinned by the belief that agriculture needs to be transformed to prevent further ecological degradation. As both a practitioner of regenerative agriculture and a PhD candidate with the opportunity to study regenerative agriculture, I count myself as one of these actors that can contribute to change. So for this reason, I've conducted my research with an action orientation, which ensures that intervention can occur throughout the research period. To act and research simultaneously, I took a practice research approach, where the practice itself becomes the research. So this has included my farming practice, which informed my interpretation of discourses, and working with a community organisation to bring about change. I had 6 practice research cycles. The first cycle included critical reflection on my own farming practice and existing literature. And this continued throughout the research period. And from it emerged the second cycle, which became my literature review. This explored 267 texts, both grey and academic texts, and it's published currently in Agriculture and Human Values. I used discourse analysis to identify key discursive themes across these texts. And discourse analysis involves closely reading the use of language to understand its different meanings. The themes demonstrated variations in how regenerative agriculture is understood, how it's practiced, how it's discussed, and how it's defined, which suggested that there was more than one discourse that existed for regen ag. Cycle 3 of my practice research continued the discourse analysis to identify and articulate specific discourses contributing to regenerative agriculture. And this was also shaped by my embeddedness in the regenerative agriculture community. This was conducted on texts from 96 regenerative organisations talking about regenerative ag, based primarily in Australia and the United States. They include websites, reports, blog posts, and other things associated with each organisation. They also included 22 semi-structured interviews with regenerative farmers, consultants, trainers, and community leaders. Throughout this process, I came to see regenerative agriculture as a story that's getting told 9 different ways. And that is to say that there were 9 different discourses that were being used to talk about regenerative agriculture and inform farming practice. I like this quote from one of my participants on the screen. When we're trying to shift towards a new way of being in the world, we need new stories to help us make sense of it. As another part of looking at these different discourses in cycle 4 was working alongside an artist, Hannah Cox, to further interpret each of the discourses using artistic practice. We discussed and painted each discourse to creatively portray their key themes and characteristics. And this is what we came up with. The first discourse is called Restoration for Profit. And in this discourse, regenerative agriculture is about restoring soil health to increase productivity and profitability, whilst also reversing climate change. This is a really powerful discourse because it's a stepping stone for conventional farmers interested in regen ag, because it focuses on things that are familiar, like bottom line profits through increased soil health. It doesn't shift too far outside of the dominant agricultural narrative, and often will conflate being regenerative with sequestering carbon. So often involves carbon farming falls under this discourse, for example. I'll move through each of the discourses only briefly to give a sense of what they are. The second discourse is big picture holism. In this discourse, regen ag is looking at the big picture of how everything is connected on the farm to make good management decisions that enhance the farmer's quality of life. It's really strongly to holistic management and planned grazing. In fact, you won't find this discourse anywhere where there isn't grazing animals. It's still rather anthropocentric because it frames animals as management tools for the farm, which other discourses don't necessarily do that. The third discourse is regenerative organic. In this discourse, regenerative ag is about building on the tenets of organic agriculture to regenerate soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness. It's completely against any use of chemical or synthetic inputs, whereas other discourses don't mind using these if they can get good environmental outcomes, or if they're see themselves in transitioning away from the usage of those chemicals. The fourth discourse is agrarian permaculture. In this discourse, regen ag is an approach to designing integrated farm systems to regenerate the land. It merges permaculture design with holistic management to make permaculture more relevant in broadacre farming. Whilst it does have a lot of the permaculture principles in it, it doesn't necessarily adopt permaculture ethics, which are earth care, people care, and fair share. The reason for this is because adherents to this discourse view those ethics or any sort of ethical narrative as a bit too ideological, and rather prefer to focus purely on the physical renewal of landscapes. The fifth discourse is regenerative cultures. In this discourse, Regen Ag is a spiritually rich and emotionally fulfilling practice at the heart of regenerative place-based cultures. The discourse is the first one so far to move beyond the farm gate and start challenging supply chain issues. It is really closely aligned with the rhetoric of the broader regeneration movement, such as like regenerative businesses and regenerative economies and those discussions that are occurring. And Regen Ag is explored within this context as a major pathway for shifting towards a culture of regeneration in society. The fundamental belief of adherents to this discourse is that deeply regenerative agriculture can only exist if it's interwoven into a regenerative culture. The sixth discourse is deep holism. In this discourse, Regen Ag is seen as a pathway for empathizing with and experiencing ecosystems as inseparable from yourself. It has links to the concept of the ecological self from deep ecology, where the place and the person are one. It doesn't care much for quantifying regenerative agriculture like some of the other discourses would do. For example, regenerative organic is very focused on what practices you do. Big picture holism or restoration for profit would be more focused on the ecological outcomes that you see from practices. Whereas this discourse sees regeneration of the land as a regeneration of the self or our identity. Its interpretation of holism is about experiencing this oneness with our surroundings, as opposed to stepping back and viewing how everything is connected on the farm like the big picture holism discourse would do. So those two discourses in particular are in contrast with each other a little bit. The seventh discourse is agroecology and food sovereignty. In this discourse, Regen Ag is about regenerating communities and having people democratically involved in the food system. This discourse represents a crossover between agroecology and regenerative agriculture, which share many technical practices and environmental goals, but depart typically on political issues of power and equity in the food system. But some farmers who identify with regenerative agriculture also adopt the principles and politics of agroecology. So that makes this discourse sort of a powerful union, I guess, between the two movements. The eighth discourse is subtle energies. And this discourse, Regen Ag, is a practice that works with the invisible or non-material dimensions of farming systems to restore energy imbalances. This is a particularly understudied discourse in Regen Ag. Often adherents will use dowsing, a kinesiology, or their intuition to make farming decisions. They may use Celtic shamanism to speak with plants in other realms. Or, for example, if a calf gets lost, then they may get a map and move their hand over the map to feel intuitively where that calf may be, and then go out and retrieve the calf. Yeah, it's a very interesting one, and it's a much smaller one than many of the other discourses. Finally, the ninth discourse is First Nations. In this discourse, Regen Ag is a new name for practices that First Nations people have been doing for tens of thousands of years. Adherents to this discourse challenge regenerative agriculture to not just repackage practices from Indigenous cultures, but also recognize their deeper worldviews. Regen Ag is founded upon many Indigenous practices that have been disconnected from their people and places, and these include things like agroforestry, rotational grazing, intercropping or companion planting, no-till, crop rotation, soil amendments, and biochar. Many very common practices that most farmers, whether regenerative or not, would not necessarily associate with Indigenous people. So in my interviews, participant 9 referred to regenerative agriculture as a stepping stone between Western and Indigenous ontologies. They said that regenerative agriculture is part of an iteration of where we need to go. When we come from this anthropocentric Western colonial view, We need stepping stones because First Nations ways of being and living are so far beyond what Western colonial spaces can really perceive. So if we look at how far each of the discourses I've just talked through are departing from the status quo, we see a scale that moves between two different ontological perspectives. On one end, some adhere to anthropocentrism and value productivity more. On the other end values relationships with the more than human world. And this world includes both what is typically considered living, such as animals or bacteria or plants or microbiology in the soil, but also non-living, such as machines, mountains, or rivers. A perfect example of this in the discourses is big picture holism, referring to animals as tools on one end, compared with First Nations people referring to them as kin or family on the other end. Those that value relationships more also tend to practice an ethic of care. This recognizes the interdependencies between all beings and means shifting from seeing ourselves as dominant in the world and acting over the world to existing within it together. When we are a part of the world instead of separate from it, we have a responsibility to care for it. The term regenerative does not need to be adopted for a farmer to have a more than human ethic of care. This is simply about prioritizing relationships with the non-human beings that live alongside us and work alongside farmers on farms. As Ives says in that quote on the screen, the scale of the sustainability crisis extends all the way from planetary systems to the heart and soul of every human being. A more than human ethic of care in agriculture is also generally championed by women. The literature shows how many female farmers imbue feminine care work into masculine agriculture, as demonstrated by this quote on the screen that says, "My womanhood has to do with my love for people and my love for animals and my love for the earth and taking good care of the soil." This more than human ethic of care has been framed as a feminine imperative in the face of an industrialized, masculine dominated agriculture. As mentioned in the First Nations discourse, many of the practices in Regen Ag, and including this relational worldview, come from Indigenous communities. Unfortunately, racial inequity is a sad reality in regenerative agriculture and other alternative food movements. For example, in the United States, 96.4% of organically certified farmers are white, and only 0.5% are African American or Indigenous farmers. Decolonizing means divesting this colonial power and includes returning Indigenous land and sovereignty. It also means welcoming and elevating the stories and experiences of Indigenous, African American, immigrant, women, and queer farmers without appropriating them. As it says on the screen, the white agricultural narrative is not the only one. It's merely a monocultural story that gets reseeded season after season. And it says down the bottom, confronting colonial constructs and the ways they continue to shape our present is a precondition for dismantling and rebuilding equitable food systems. In my interviews here in Australia, 5 out of 16 of the non-Indigenous regenerative farmers were starting to engage with issues of Indigenous sovereignty. 3 of these participants felt that the regenerative movement couldn't go further without placing Indigenous sovereignty at the centre. Participant 21 particularly referred directly to shutting up and listening, shifting structures of power and participation in the food system, and being prepared to give up privileges and ownership. She said, "I've got this very strong and growing sense that we can't be practicing regenerative agriculture if we're not having First Nations knowledge and ownership and history in the picture. So I'm still working out what that means at the farm level." Having 5 of my non-Indigenous participants raise this issue without prompt was a significant thing, I thought. But in the literature, adherence to Regen Ag remains still largely silent on issues of equity and power. So it's fair that this experience with farmers could be an anomaly, with such issues still insufficiently addressed in regenerative ag. In my practice research cycle 5, I partnered with the Institute of Ecological Agriculture, or IEA. This is a practitioner-led cooperative that advocates for regenerative food systems and is responsible for writing the degrees in regenerative agriculture at Southern Cross University. The Institute and I started exploring how this more than human relationality might be transformative for Regen Ag. Even the discourses that prioritize productivism have some level of more than human relationality in them. For example, restoration for profit, which is very similar to the mainstream, acknowledges reciprocity between people and soil and the livingness of soil. This means that valuing relationships with the more than human world is at some level common ground between all of the discourses. The IEA felt that this relational view was the most transformative aspect of Regen Ag because it radically challenges dominant assumptions and values in agriculture. But when definitions reduce Regen Ag either to practices or outcomes alone, they can lose sight of this relational way of being in the world. As Seymour says in this quote, attempting to communicate regenerative agriculture through science by reducing it solely to practices and outcomes ignores the transformative mindset shift that is a new way of thinking and being. And the Institute of Ecological Ag found that focusing our efforts on the non-quantifiable aspects of regenerative agriculture was an important pathway for transformation. And if definitions only engage with the aspects of Regen Ag that science understands, then they can become tools for ensuring that Regen Ag conforms to the dominant and colonial way of viewing agriculture today. And that's not to say that science is not really important, only that it is not the only framework for understanding what regenerative agriculture is. Other frameworks also exist alongside it and can be found in formerly silenced or marginalized voices, such as First Nations people, which openly advocate for more relational perspectives. In my data, those discourses that really valued relationality were smaller than those who prioritized productivity. In this image, you can see that restoration for profit is the largest discourse. It's also the most similar to the mainstream. And this is not a bad thing because it's a really strong entry point for so many farmers into regenerative agriculture. But if it dominates Regen Ag too much, then it can imbue the movement with current agricultural ideas that are less transformative than the ones in some of those more marginal discourses. So the risk is that those minority discourses such as First Nations, deep holism, agroecology, and subtle energies will move further and further to the fringe and get forgotten about as regenerative agriculture gets larger. And that means, of course, that the groups who use those discourses will no longer feel included in regenerative agriculture. If this occurs, then the focus on relationships could fall away. Either way, it's likely that Regen Ag, as it becomes more popular, may move from having multiple interpretations to being more and more uniform. I've been using the term structuration in the research to refer to Regen Ag becoming more consistent, internally consistent in this way. And it may mean that a particular discourse becomes dominant in Regen Ag, such as restoration for profit, or that multiple discourses co-evolve together and create something new. But because landscapes, farming contexts, and communities are so diverse around the world, retaining a level of flexibility in the interpretation and implementation of regenerative ag is a good thing. Cusworth in this quote says, there is a risk that the mainstreaming, scaling up, and globalizing of a singular model of regenerative agriculture will ride roughshod over the pre-existing diversity of agroecological practice. In its yet to be determined future, regenerative agriculture risks perpetuating colonial relations, but also has the potential to learn from, integrate with, and enhance existing transformative practices. One way to avoid this streamlining of a single Regen Ag model and instead retain some multi-interpretability is through trans-local networks. And these blend local embeddedness with global connectedness. This is my Friday the 13th appropriate spooky model of trans-local networks. So when local initiatives across the globe become connected, they can create these networks that exchange ideas So they're globally sharing principles, identities, and storylines, but these can get translated very differently at the local level. For example, regen ag can be interpreted vaguely at the global level, yet specifically at the local level. So it can have a sense of uniformity at that global level, but also multi-interpretability when in local contexts. The more of the discourses that get included in the storytelling of regenerative agriculture at that global level, the more room there will be for diverse approaches at the local level. So, for example, if regen ag marginalizes Indigenous people in its high-level definitions, then it's unlikely that those groups are going to continue to work under the umbrella of a movement that doesn't recognize their contributions. And this will also, of course, continue patterns of colonialism. The more people who are able to participate in regenerative agriculture, the more likely it will be to challenge the dominant approach to farming and be transformative. So as a recap, regenerative agriculture is a story told at least 9 different ways. The further these ways of talking about regen ag depart from the mainstream, the more they value more than human relationships and an ethic of care founded in First Nations worldviews. This is transformative because it challenges current agricultural assumptions and values, including a dominant masculinity in agriculture. But regen ag also risks losing this view if the more marginal discourses that advocate relationality the strongest get pushed to the fringes and are not included in definitions. So it's important to retain these interpretations instead of simply globalizing a single model of regen ag that may damage current agroecological diversity. Through translocal networks, regen ag could retain a shared meaning at the global level, whilst also remaining context specific and embedded at the local level. And this would allow for clarity in regenerative agriculture as a movement, whilst also supporting diversity of interpretation, application, and including marginal voices. The more people who are able to participate in regenerative agriculture, the more likely it is to address issues of equity and power in the food system, to decolonize itself, and change the way we relate to farming, all of which is required if transformation is going to be possible. And that is that. Thanks very much, everyone, and happy to have questions.